At 62, Eddie Van Halen reveals 6 guitarists he hated the most. He built the Frankenstrat with his own hands. He spent nights in his Pasadena bedroom rewinding his own pickups, soldering circuits, and chasing a sound nobody had ever made before. When Eddie Van Halen finally unleashed that sound on the world in 1978, everything changed. The guitar was never the same again. But behind the grin and the flying fingers, behind the swagger and the stage explosions, Eddie Van Halen carried wounds that never fully healed. Some came from heroes who dismissed him. Some came from peers who stole from him. And some came from rivals who, by simply existing, made him feel things he was not entirely prepared to feel. These are the 6 guitarists who got under Eddie Van Halen's skin the most, backed by the words he actually said in the interviews he actually gave. Number 6, Eric Clapton. The first person Eddie Van Halen ever publicly named as his musical god was Eric Clapton. Among the first things the public ever learned about Eddie Van Halen, when Jas Obrecht interviewed him for Guitar Player's November 1978 issue, was the key influence behind his furiously fast, technically precise, but melodic electric guitar work. I'd say the main one, believe it or not, was Eric Clapton. I mean, I know I don't sound like him. That qualifier, I know I don't sound like him, tells you everything. Even at the height of his first surge of fame, Eddie was already anticipating the comparison and stepping around it. He adored what Clapton had built while being fully aware that he had built something else entirely. IMDb. For years, the admiration ran in only one direction. Then came the fracture. In 1983, Brian May's Starfleet Project mini-album featured a blues workout called Blues Breaker, dedicated to Clapton, with May and Van Halen trading solos. Clapton was not pleased by what he heard. While he held his tongue when speaking with Guitar Player in 1985, he vented his feelings to Musician magazine shortly after, in 1986. It was so horrible, and they dedicated it to me, he said. They sent me a copy, and I put it on expecting something. And I was almost insulted because they can't play. Clapton added that if Eddie wanted to play blues, he had to approach it as a style with rules, like Japanese kabuki theater. Certain things you do, and certain things you don't. IMDb. Those words reached Eddie, and they burned. He had worshipped this man. He had slowed down Cream Records to study every bend. And here was the god of his youth declaring that he simply could not play. Eddie was hurt, but he still hoped to remain friends with Clapton. Some years after, at a party in New York City, Eddie attempted to patch things up. He was reportedly drunk. Clapton, newly sober, came off as dismissive. Eddie was furious. "Forget that teabag," he said. The relationship never recovered. Eddie was still hurt a few years later when he sat down for an interview conducted by Dweezil Zappa in Guitar Player's March 1995 issue. Nearly 20 years after he praised Clapton, Eddie offered a new assessment. "I grew up on Clapton, but don't hate me, Eric. It's like he doesn't do that anymore. Now when he solos, to me it's like he's pissing up a rope." But he also said, listen to his early solos, all the Cream stuff. He spoke when he played. And I thought every time I solo, I should make it like that too. The love was still there, beneath the bitterness. It made the wound worse, not better. NBC Los Angeles. Number 5, Ritchie Blackmore. Eddie grew up on Blackmore the way he grew up on Clapton. With reverence, studying the deep purple of every riff and the classical architecture beneath every solo. And like Clapton, Blackmore returned that devotion with something cold enough to leave a mark. In a 1982 Guitar Player interview with Jas Obrecht, Eddie was candid about the early days of Van Halen's touring life. "There's one thing that bothered me so much in the very beginning, in '78, our first tour, is how people like Joe Perry and other guitarists would just give me the shaft with their eyes. Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No, nothing." He then named Blackmore directly. "I just think about people like Joe Perry or Ritchie Blackmore, who all hate my guts anyway. They wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody because they would feel threatened." AXS TV. The phrase, "give me the shaft with their eyes," is one of the most specific and painful things Eddie ever said publicly about another musician. Not a slap, not an argument, not a professional dispute, just a look. A cold, blank, dismissive look from a man whose poster had once hung on his wall. The silence of it was the point. Blackmore's mystique had always depended on distance. And when the young kid from Pasadena came around hoping for some acknowledgement, Blackmore gave him nothing. Years later, Blackmore admitted publicly that Van Halen had brought something new, and that what he had done with the whammy bar and tapping was clever. But for Eddie, who had wanted a handshake in 1978, the belated recognition felt like a compliment delivered a decade too late. Number 4. Joe Perry. Joe Perry of Aerosmith occupied the same category in Eddie's frustration as Blackmore, the established rock star who looked at the new arrival not with curiosity, but with calculation. In the same 1982 interview, Eddie described the early touring experience plainly. People like Joe Perry and Richie Blackmore, who all hate my guts anyway, they wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody because they would feel threatened. The word threatened is the key. Eddie was not describing hurt feelings alone. He was describing what he believed was a deliberate strategy by the old guard, to ignore, to dismiss, to refuse even common courtesy to the young guitarist who had just redrawn the map of what an electric guitar could do. AXS TV. Perry eventually came around completely. In 2013, speaking to Van Halen News Desk, he described hearing the debut Van Halen album and being blown away. He said Eddie had taken everything he had heard and put his own stamp on it, and that he had reinvented guitar playing. He admitted he kept going back to figure out the tricks, the sound, the energy. That turnaround said everything about the seismic impact Eddie had made. Even the men who once ignored him had to eventually admit what he had done. But Eddie never forgot what it felt like to be the young guitarist reaching for a handshake and getting a cold shoulder instead. Number 3. Tom Scholz. The Tom Scholz story is one of the most specific and colorful grievances in Eddie Van Halen's entire catalog of frustrations. It did not involve a dismissive look or a cold shoulder. It involved something Eddie witnessed from the stage with his own eyes, in front of an audience. In a 1979 Guitar Player interview, Eddie described exactly what happened when Van Halen played before Boston on a shared bill. Tom Scholz from Boston too. We played right before them, I forget where, and I do my solo. And then all of a sudden, he does my solo. And it was real weird, because it was a daytime thing. I was standing on stage, and the whole crowd was looking at me like, what's this guy doing? I was drunk, and I got pissed. AARP. There it was, his own solo, played back at him from the stage he had just vacated, in front of the same crowd. Eddie had spent years building that sound from nothing. He had rewound his own pickups, built his own guitar, and chased a tone nobody else had found. To hear it replicated note for note in the next set was not flattery. It was theft of identity, and Scholz compounded the injury with silence. As Eddie put it bluntly, Tom Scholz is a real dick. He's unsociable. I guess he just thinks he's God or something. He never comes around. He doesn't say hi. He doesn't do anything. He just kind of hides out, runs on stage and plays, and disappears afterwards. The combination of imitation without acknowledgement and total social withdrawal hit Eddie in exactly the spot he was most sensitive. He could accept inspiration. He could not accept duplication paired with arrogance. AARP. Number 2. Yngwie Malmsteen. The Yngwie Malmsteen situation operated in reverse from most of Eddie's other conflicts. Here, Eddie was not the young man being ignored by a hero. He was the established figure being unsettled by the arrival of someone new. And according to Malmsteen's own detailed account, Eddie's response to that discomfort was to run. Literally. Malmsteen recalled the 1986 Grammys with striking specificity. I go to the show, I had my tux on and everything, and I see Eddie there. I'm waving at him, trying to get his attention, and he sees me, and he runs away. GEO.TV. It did not end there. Malmsteen also described a festival in Holland where Van Halen were headlining. I was doing a concert festival in Holland, and Van Halen were headlining. I'm like, great, I finally get to meet Eddie. But I found out they canceled the show. They said Alex Van Halen had broken his little finger or something. And then I hear that the promoter got a phone call from Eddie himself, who said, just to let you know, if Yngwie Malmsteen is playing, I'm not playing. And I will never playing the same stage as Yngwie Malmsteen. GEO.TV. also claimed that while Eddie publicly denied knowing who he was when asked about him in grocery stores and interviews, David Lee Roth told a different story. According to Malmsteen, Dave Roth told me that Eddie would have his ghetto blaster, playing my stuff on it all day long. It painted a portrait of private obsession combined with public denial. The behavior of a man who felt more unsettled by a rival than he was willing to let anyone see. Himself said, "I'm like, what?" He obviously felt threatened, which is crazy to me. You're Eddie Van Halen. No one could threaten you. The irony was sharp. The man who had spent his early career being dismissed by his heroes was now doing the same thing to someone else. Number 1. Randy Rhoads. No rivalry in Eddie Van Halen's career generated more heat, more complexity, or more lasting debate than his relationship with Randy Rhoads. They were the two dominant guitar figures of the early 1980s, constantly compared, constantly pitted against each other by the press, and privately navigating feelings that neither of them ever fully resolved before Rhoads died in a plane crash in 1982. In archival audio captured and later featured in the documentary Randy Rhoads, Reflections of a Guitar Icon, Eddie's feelings were on full, unguarded display. Well, he was one guitarist who was honest anyway, because I read some interviews that he did, and he said everything that he did, he learned from me. And he was good. AXS TV. That statement, part compliment, part possessive claim, landed hard in the guitar world. Eddie was asserting authorship over the techniques that Rhoads had developed into his own singular voice. Ozzy Osbourne pushed back directly. Osbourne said publicly, "To be honest, Randy didn't have a nice thing to say about Eddie. Maybe they had a falling out or whatever, but they were rivals." NPR. The truth, as usual, was more complicated. According to original Quiet Riot bassist Kelly Garni, who knew Rhoads well, the supposed animosity bore little resemblance to reality. When Van Halen exploded onto the Los Angeles club scene, Rhoads' curiosity eventually overcame any competitive instinct. Garni recalled that Rhoads went to see Van Halen perform and came away impressed, if understated. Randy said, "I'll go see what the deal is." He saw him play and said, "Yeah, okay, the guy's good." Rhoads even made it backstage, though the timing was poor. Eddie was acting kind of crazy and bouncing off the walls in his underwear, Garni said. And Randy was like, "Oh, okay. Ultimate classic rock, ultimate classic rock." In a 1982 Guitar World interview, Rhoads distanced himself from the argument that he had learned his chops from Van Halen, instead revealing he had skipped the imitation stage that many aspiring players go through. In the same breath, he praised Van Halen as a great player and one who clearly had his own unique style of playing, something Rhoads said he also wanted to develop naturally by himself. The rivalry at its core was two young men who respected each other far more than either was prepared to admit, trapped in a narrative the press was determined to push. NPR. Guitar virtuoso Yngwie Malmsteen, who rose to prominence after Rhoads' death in 1982, has claimed that Van Halen avoided sharing bills with him to sidestep direct comparisons, suggesting that at least from one observer's perspective, Eddie's pattern of discomfort around rivals who threatened his position continued beyond the Rhoads era. Ultimate classic rock. Eddie Van Halen lived with these tensions for decades. He was the man who had reinvented the guitar and could not understand why his own heroes dismissed him. He was the man who felt his innovation stolen and his identity mimicked. He was the man who, by his own later admission, had himself become the kind of figure that younger players feared and circled at a distance. He took one rule from the very hero who hurt him most: a solo should tell a story. Everything else he built himself from the ground up in a Pasadena bedroom, with no approval from anyone.